Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome to today's program, and welcome Sister Marzia Hassan. So today's topic is building resilience through self-compassion, and we have with us Sister Marzia Hassan. So I'm going to give a short introduction about her, and then we'll get started with her talk and then move on to a Q&A and discussion at the end. So inshallah, we hope that this is beneficial for you. Before we do get started, I would like to request that everybody recite a Surah Fatiha. So Sister Nuzhat, who usually hosts these programs, has actually had a death in her family. Her grandma has passed away. So if we can recite a Surah Fatiha for her grandma and all the marhumin. Okay, so I'd like to introduce Sister Marzia Hassan. She is an author, a public speaker, and a marriage and family therapist. And she works with individuals, couples, as well as families. She started her working career as a high-powered corporate lawyer. But after she started her own family, she realized that her true passion was in empowering and strengthening families to create intentional and healthy relationships. After a decade of self and professional study, Sister Marzia now works as a social worker and relationship consultant with individuals, couples, and families. After obtaining her master's in social work, she started Family Connections International, which is a psychotherapy practice based in Toronto and online. And having lived and experienced life in 3 continents, Sister Marzia combines Western scientific thought with Eastern spiritual wisdom to bring a unique and practical aspect to her work with families. She is also an author. She's authored 2 books, Parenting in the Age of Facebook, Raising the Net Generation, and her second book is called Wind Beneath Your Wings. So we will link those books at the end in the chat so you can check them out. And Sister Marzia, the floor is yours.
Okay, just gonna put on my video. There we go. Okay, good. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. And let's start. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajeem. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. As-salatu was-salamu ala Muhammadin wa alihi tayyibin at-tahirin. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatam min lisani yafqahu qawli. Rabbi zidni ilman. So assalamu alaikum. And it would be great actually if at least some of us can put on the video so I can see you too. It's actually really hard to speak in front of a screen when there's so good. At least I can see one more person. And just hang on one second. I'm just going to adjust myself so that. Okay. So tell me, how interactive are these? Do people generally talk, contribute, or is it going to be a one-way thing?
So we've had a few, we had one a few days ago where it was a little bit more interactive towards the end. People had a lot of questions about career and branding their business. So it honestly depends. Maybe we could start with a small discussion from you, and then more than happy to get people to contribute as well and make it a conversation.
Okay, good. And we have about an hour?
Yeah, about an hour. We can go over an hour though.
Yeah, no, I know. I've been doing a few of these things and they've been going very long. So
okay, we can stick to an hour then.
Let's see. I'm just going to. I don't know why it's showing me so many different. There we go. Okay. So hopefully people can see the screen right now. And the topic that we are going to be discussing, inshallah, today is called Building Resilience Through Self-Compassion. And, before anything else, obviously, we need to understand what we're talking about, how so let's start with a few definitions, right? So generally, what is our reason for being here and what is causing so much stress around the world is obviously, we know, the pandemic, right? And resilience is something which can help us. So, basically, what is resilience? Let's start with that. Resilience is the ability to face adversity, to go through challenges without being overwhelmed by them, right? And another way to put it, it's simply the capacity to manage challenge and to recover from adversity. So, one of the things we know about life is that it will always throw us challenges, sometimes small ones, sometimes big ones. Sometimes we think we're the only ones going through struggle and stress, and everyone else seems to be managing fine. And I think in this age of social media, this is a big thing, right? Because we obviously are seeing other people's images, other people's stories, and they all seem to be coping a lot better than we are. Right. And I think even today, in the midst of this pandemic, I know sometimes when I go on Instagram, I'm like, I'm having a really hard time today. Like, I'm having a hard time just getting going, just getting even stuff what I need to get done. And here is everyone, working out and making all of these fancy food. And so everyone else seems to be coping better. At least that's what it seems like, right? But, so in essence, resilience is the capacity to face challenges. But even if you fall down, it's not about not falling down. It's not about not failing. In fact, we will talk a bit about failure, quote unquote failure. But it is the ability to what we call bounce back. Right? So even if you have a setback, if you have a struggle, you have this inner quality which can rise up to the, to the occasion and actually, help you do your best, even when, things are not, going according to your plan, right? So why does resilience matter? Obviously, it matters because, given that we are always going to have challenges in this world, I mean, our faith basically guarantees it, right? Allah tells us in the Quran that you will be tried. Like, that's one of the constants in life, that we will face challenges. And so it makes sense that if we have an inner quality which can help us face them and not be defeated, then, it's a valuable thing, right? Now, what is compassion and how does that relate? So, right now we're like basically doing a bunch of definitions and then we put them all together, right? So compassion, a lot of people understand, what is compassion? It simply means that it is a wish, it is a feeling that another entity or a being not suffer, right? And, compassion itself, like when you go into the neuroscience of it, compassion has within it, the feeling of compassion has within it this idea of taking action to help alleviate somebody's suffering, right? But, the important thing to remember is that even if you can't, so very often, like, we see somebody suffer, we see somebody going through a hard time, and we have this feeling of compassion and we can't do anything about it, right? So the ability to do something is not important, right? What is important is the desire to alleviate suffering, right? So it's very much an emotion, it's very much a feeling. So, we need to understand that compassion does not mean that you like the other person. It has nothing to do, or very little to do with, just being a friend or having someone close to you. Like, you can have compassion for someone you know nothing about. You may not even like them, but again, it is the idea that it is the human in you that is responding to the human suffering of the other person, right? And by the way, you can also have compassion for people, very often, and, the way our cultures work is we tend to be very strict human beings, right? Like, we don't have too much room generally, and I'm speaking very broadly, I understand that. But we're very much, okay, come on with it, no time for all of this wishy-washy, feeling sorry for yourself and all of that, right? And when people have caused, quote unquote, their own suffering, we tend to be a little less compassionate, but it actually doesn't have to be that way. Like, even if you think that a person say they didn't wake up in time and they never showed up for work and then they got fired, right? That would be a way that somebody can contribute to their own failure. You could still feel compassion for them, even if you think that, you know what, they did this. So what I'm saying is that compassion is something that can coexist with a lot of other feelings. It doesn't mean that if you have compassion that you're not holding somebody accountable for their actions, right? That's not what it means. Very often we mistake that, right? So compassion basically wants to help even if you can't. And again, studies show that the circuitry of action in our brain, like the things that desire us to take action, that is what gets triggered when we feel compassion for another person, right? So now, that's just general compassion. What is self-compassion? Self-compassion simply means that it's the same feeling that you have for somebody else, but you apply it to yourself. Does that make sense? So, the idea that that a being not suffer, but that being is you yourself. It is somebody who wears what we call your name tag, okay? And the reason why this is important is because very often we find it easy to have compassion for other people, but a lot of people find it very challenging to have compassion for ourselves. And, we could talk about why that is. Like, there's many, many reasons, but we'll also talk about why it is extremely important to have that compassion for yourself. So now again, to remind ourselves that self-compassion does not mean that you're whining, that you have self-pity, that you're saying, oh, woe is me, feeling really sorry for yourself, all of that, right? It doesn't mean that you're wallowing in misery and you're giving up. It doesn't mean any of these things, right? Because these are some of the common misconceptions why people have a challenge with this. And we come to why, we need to get over these hurdles because it's so important, right? It's also not about trying to get sympathy from others. It's not about avoiding responsibility. So we will talk a little bit about that you can have a lot of compassion for yourself, but at the same time, you can hold yourself accountable. Holding yourself accountable means, yes, I did, I didn't show up for work on time for 1 week. And that was my mistake. The difference between having self-compassion versus self-criticism, and that's how they're usually compared to each other, right? With self-criticism, you have a lot of blame against yourself. And one of the key things to remember about self-criticism is that it is like, I always think of it as being at war with yourself. War with yourself means what? So say, for example, I've been fired, okay? So I didn't show up to work, whatever I did, I've been fired, and now I have to deal with that situation, right? But if I have all of this self-criticism against myself, then I'm going to feel sorry for myself. I'm going to either blame other people, to protect myself, or I'll blame myself, right? But if I'm blaming myself, so now I'm feeling bad, and on top of that, I am beating myself up, right? What kind of energy does that leave me to take action? Very little, right? And that's the key thing to remember, that self-criticism is a very draining emotion. It's a very draining practice. Why? Because when we are so harsh on ourselves, it's almost like, you take a wounded being, you lock them up in a room, you beat them up, and you throw away the key, right? So you can never ever heal, and you have no energy left for doing anything about your predicament, right? So self-compassion actually frees up all of that energy that you would otherwise use to fight with yourself. Does that make sense? So I'm just going to pause here just for a second, and in case people have questions or comments, just to see if things are clear or not. And I'm not sure where the chat would be because I'm seeing my...
Yeah, so if anyone has a question pertaining to whatever's been discussed until now, you can type it in the chat box, or you can message it to me privately, or you can unmute yourself and ask the question. I think we might be okay so far with questions.
Sorry?
I don't think we have any questions yet.
Okay. So, if any questions do come up, like especially in the chat box, because for some reason
Yeah.
I'm not seeing the chat box, so just read them
no
out.
worries.
Okay? Okay. So now let's talk a little bit about why self-compassion matters. Like, why bother with this, right? Because a lot of us actually spend a long time, many years of our lives beating ourselves up, being self-critical. And the idea is that, what is our motivation to change, right? Why should we change? So, when neuroscientists study, positive emotions such as gratitude, kindness, generosity, or delight, love, it turns out that self-compassion is actually really potent, like it's very, very powerful, because again, it activates our caregiving system. It activates the ability and the willingness and the energy to take care of ourselves. And what that means by taking care of ourselves is actually it helps us act in our own best interests, right? So and again, we might need to say a little bit more about that. When I'm talking about self-interest, I'm talking about what I like to refer to as enlightened self-interest, right? Enlightened self-interest means that, and again, let's put it in a spiritual context, that's something that, I'm meant to do, a purpose that I'm here, something that God will be pleased with, right? So that's the kind of, when I'm talking about enlightened self-interest, that's what I mean. In the short term, say, for example, let's take something simple like exercising, right? When we are, when we feel lazy, okay, so you know that you should, quote unquote, should exercise, but you just don't, like you haven't done it for a week, for example, right? And if you were self-critical, then you may be able to motivate yourself in the short term, right? You may be able to beat yourself up and get yourself to do whatever, but it won't last. Why? Because again, it takes a lot of energy to be self-critical and beat down upon yourself, right? On the other hand, if you were, and by the way, there's a lot of research now that shows that, we've always grown up with this idea that in order to motivate ourselves, in order to have willpower, we need to be really strict with ourselves, right? I'm sure, many people can relate. However, what research is showing now is that willpower is extremely connected to self-compassion. So people who have compassion for themselves actually end up having more willpower, and they are able to follow their own enlightened self-interest more than people who are self-critical. Because again, self-criticism is very all-consuming. Unlike what we sometimes think, that if we are self-compassionate, we will be, we'll go too easy on ourselves. It actually turns out that when you are critical of yourself, you are so drained and you're so exhausted that it's hard to take action for your own good, right? So what the self-compassion research shows is that people who regularly practice self-compassion, and we'll talk about what that means, like, what does it mean to practice something? They have less stress, less anxiety, depression, loneliness. They have more friendships, social support. They're more optimistic. They have better health, better sleep. They live longer lives by 7 to 9 years on average. And, all of these things like resilience, which is the ability to bounce back, is a direct outcome of these practices. In other words, more compassion leads to more resilience, okay? And so again, the idea is that, when we are motivated to act and change, it's not because we are worthless or inadequate, which is the result of self-criticism, right? It is because we care about ourselves, we want to do the best for ourselves, and we are, we're willing to put in the time and the energy and the discipline to do that, okay? Now, given that this is a session, geared towards youth and towards students in particular, let's talk a little bit about, how students fare, right? Or how the young people fare. It turns out that adolescents and youth today are under extreme and intense pressures of all kinds, right? And what I'm hearing, is that even like as the schools are closed, universities are closed, people are very stressed out about how it's going to impact their their careers, their path forward, all of these things, right? And even though it would seem that given that everyone's in the same situation, not really everyone's not in the same situation, but just for argument's sake, in the sense that when the university is closed for everyone, right? If whoever is whatever they're putting online or whatever, right? I mean, in that situation, everyone's on the same page. Even so, people are extremely stressed. Why? Because they have a lot of pressure about success, a lot of pressure about, and youth today have a lot of pressure about, fitting in, the body image. So all of that, what it leads to is that evaluations of themselves, the way they look at themselves, are very often unfavorable, right? And it's because of social media obviously has a big role to play in this again. Why? Because when you look at the outside, the curated images, the edited images of other people, on social media, for example, and you compare that with your reality, because your reality, but for other people, all you're seeing is their curated images, right? So when you do that, it is it's very easy to fall into the trap that I am being compared, I am faring unfavorably compared to everyone else, okay? And, these kinds of negative self-judgments are very highly correlated with anxiety, depression, and even attempted suicides, right? We know that, the period of youth is very susceptible to all of these things, right? And a big reason, not the only reason by any stretch of the imagination, but one of the key reasons for this is, again, this negative comparison and the sense of competitiveness that, in order to, I have to compete with others in order to, be worthy of anything, okay? And part of the way that the West especially has tried to manage the situation is by really working, for a long time now, the trend has been to focus on self-esteem, right? At least, I mean, it's changing now, but till very recently, everyone was focused on building self-esteem with our children and with the youth and all of that, right? And what we are finding now, especially what psychologists are finding now, that first thing is that self-esteem is quite difficult to change and to raise. It's not like a self-compassion, which is a practice which you can actually do, right? You can actually do something about. Again, self-esteem, like that's a big topic. My own, very cheats version of understanding it is that self-esteem is basically a result of living life according to your values. If you follow your inner guidance and you follow your conscience, you are more likely to have, good self-esteem. But anyway, let's put that aside, right? What psychologists have found that, when they tried to raise self-esteem in schools through programs and all, they actually didn't work, right? They didn't work. And speaking from a parental perspective, actually parents unknowingly did quite a bit of harm in trying to raise self-esteem. They thought that, this means that you just praise children a lot, you shower them with a lot of praise, and their self-esteem will grow. It actually turns out that it had the opposite effect. Children were more anxious, more depressed as a result of being fed junk praise. And again, that's a huge topic. But so the idea is that even when we are able to raise self-esteem through all of these means, especially like praise and all, it's found that it can give rise to other problematic behavior such as aggression, bullying, and narcissism, right? Also, self-esteem is very tied to competition, like in the sense is that we need to be better than someone else, right? And when we are focusing on other people in that sense that we need to be better than them, and social comparison, all of these things, they actually foster disconnection, right? Why? Because obviously we are looking at other people as obstacles in order to overcome, to keep our position, to mark our territory, and to vanquish potential rivals. Now, people who are in a very highly academic program, for example, at school or at university will really understand what I'm talking about, right? In academic situations, sporting situations, all of these are literally geared towards competition, in that you have to mark yourself out as special because you are better than everyone else, right? And so what I'm saying is that this whole self-esteem movement did not work, and now the trend or the drive is towards understanding it more in terms of self-compassion rather than self-esteem, right? And so what's the difference, right? With self-compassion, you value yourself not because you are better than anyone else and others are negative and you are somehow better, but because you are intrinsically deserving of care and concern like everyone else. It's a self-compassion and compassion in general is a very connecting emotion. What I mean by very connecting emotion is that, one of the biggest, there's three main parts to self-compassion, but a key thing is the idea of common humanity. That I am a human being like everyone else. Just like everyone else suffers, I suffer. When somebody loses their job, they feel disappointed, they feel upset. And just like that, I'm feeling upset because I've lost my job, right? And when I'm feeling like this, it's actually connecting me to other human beings rather than separating me, which is a result of competition, right? And we know that, and this is something that, we've talked about in many different places, that the way we are connected, we're created as human beings, is that we thrive on connection. Human beings thrive with connection and they really wither with isolation, right? So where self-esteem leaves us powerless, self-compassion can actually really empower us. It can give us inner strength and it can help us, learn as well. So, let's talk a little bit now about dealing with setbacks, or what some people might call failure, right? When you are so focused on being better than someone else, or you're focused on self-esteem, you see failure as a big setback, right? You see failure as failure. Means when you don't succeed at something, there's something either wrong with you, or there is, you're inherently not valuable, right? When you're motivated by self-compassion, you can see failure as a learning opportunity. Why? Because again, you know that you're a human being just like everyone else, that you are not perfect. This whole idea of perfectionism is very tied to self-criticism, right? So, and criticism, like if somebody gives you feedback, for example, there's usually some element, or there may be an element or a grain of truth in it, right? When we're focused on competition or self-esteem, if somebody gives us feedback, we either become defensive, means we don't believe them, we blame them, or we beat ourselves up and we blame ourselves, right? Between these two extremes is what? We really miss the lesson or the learning opportunity in the feedback, right? So when we are focused on self-compassion rather than self-criticism, we can actually acknowledge that, yes, it's kind of hurt, so it's kind of embarrassing to get this feedback, and we can see that it is also probably useful. We should consider it, we should look at it and then decide whether or not it is it's worth something, right? So again, the idea that when we are, when we practice self-compassion, we are not threatened by criticism. We are not threatened with failure, right? We know that our internal self-worth is not, our internal self-worth is actually independent of whether or not we succeed at something. So say, for example, if I was a student at university and I did really badly in a course, okay, and I got a failing grade, if I had internal self-worth, if I had resilience, if I had self-compassion, if I had a growth mindset, I would look at it and I would say, yeah, okay, here's what I did, here's what I could have done better, and I will try again. When we're focused on self-criticism, on the other hand, it can, that D or an F or something can take on a huge meaning. It can, rather than a failing grade, I can make it mean that it's about my whole self and I'm a failure, right? So you see the difference, right? I failed a course or I didn't pass a course versus I'm a failure. If I'm a failure, then there's not much I can do, because even if I get 10 A's, I could still think of myself as a failure, right? But if I get a failing grade, or if I'm not doing well in a course, there's many things I can do to actually change the situation, okay? Again, this is all, more of the same. Also, the idea that even it's not only when you deal with failure, but also people who are super high achievers. Very often the top of the, the top of the class or whatever, a lot of students who are doing really well struggle with a lot of anxiety. Like this, I'm seeing a lot of these days, right? And it all comes from the same kind of thinking that my self-worth or my value as a human being depends on how well I do. Also, even if I'm doing really well, right? The anxiety comes from what? It comes from, the next course might not be so easy, or there might be something that I do wrong. So when you are struggling to maintain your status, right? You are always scared of losing it, because that's reality. No matter how bright you are, there might be somebody who is brighter, more hardworking, all of that, right? And when you lose your status as a good student, or if you get a bad grade, then if you go into the self-judgment and the self-criticism, it can really be harming for you, okay? And for super achievers, there's this quite interesting syndrome. It's been named as the Stanford floating duck syndrome. What that means is, and I'm sure many students here can relate, that on the surface, it looks like people are, they're really calmly gliding along. Like when you look at a duck, it seems to be so serene and everything is, lovely. But if you look under the water, what you realize is that they are paddling their legs furiously just to stay afloat, right? And that's the kind of situation that we see with anxious students, right? So they may be doing really well, but at the end of it, their internal state is anything but calm. It's anything but even celebrating their success. They're continuously, pedaling really hard just to stay afloat, and wanting to keep that status, right? So blocks to self-compassion, we'll go through this pretty quickly. Because we've been talking about it already. The myths are that it'll make you weak and complacent, and that it'll make you selfish, and the feeling that you don't deserve it, right? And lastly, let's deal with this one, because it tends to be a big thing. We somehow got the message that in order to be quote unquote good Muslims, we need to be really strict with ourselves, okay? That we can't let ourselves go, that we need to. And so again, there's a big difference. There is, one thing is doing your best. One is holding yourself accountable. All of these things are completely legit, right? What is not helpful is doing all of this with an attitude of self-criticism, an attitude of this continuous feeling that you're not good enough, this continuous agitation, right? And, again, the idea that, when we look at Islam, if we were to talk about Islam in one word, it would be the religion of Rahmah, right? So we have a beneficent Lord, he created based on Rahmah, like that's his impetus for creation. He sent a prophet that is Rahmatul Lil Alameen. He sent a book that is the book of Rahmah. He himself has written Rahmah on himself, and he asks us to practice Rahmah, right? All of these things, like we are surrounded by the attitude of, and Rahmah, by the way, is compassion or mercy. It's usually translated as mercy, but I think compassion is probably a better translation. So, all of this, and why do we exclude ourselves from this idea of compassion, right? This is really something that we need to address for ourselves if we have this idea of self-criticism all the time, number one. And number two, we also need to ask, is self-criticism making us better human beings? Is it making us happier? Is it making us kinder to ourselves, right? If it is not, and it's generally not, right? Because here's the thing, if we are critical to ourselves, we are always critical to other people. We can't give what we don't have. So if we are not self-compassionate, if we don't practice compassionate towards ourselves, we cannot possibly be kind or compassionate or merciful to anybody else. And that itself, like as a spiritual reason, is such an important motivation, right? And the way I always look at it is, what? We've tried to do it this way for so long. We've tried to practice the self-judgment, the self-criticism. It's made us, for the most part, unhappy and sometimes not very nice human beings to live with. And now for a while, why not just practice compassion, see how we go? And if we decide, no, I'm not becoming more spiritual, I'm not becoming better, people around me are not happier, we can always go back, right? The self-criticism, the self-judgment, honestly, it's not going to go away so easily, right? It's always there. So try it is what I would say, right? Try it, and if it doesn't work, we can always go back to how we are right now. So, one of the things, one of the big concerns tends to be that, if we are so compassionate to ourselves, then we are just doing, kamma, kamma, die, it's okay, you don't have to do anything, right? But that's not what we're talking about, right? So the cost, first of all, of self-criticism is what? That, first of all, it feels really bad. And we don't really, grief is there. Challenges are there, right? We don't need to make it harder than it is. You know what I mean? So like the outside challenges of the world are definitely there. But internally, we don't need to add more challenges on top of the challenges that are already there, okay? So self-criticism leads to more stress. It's really bad for physical and mental health. There's less learning because, again, our energy is consumed with wanting to defend ourselves, either to defend ourselves, to blame someone else, or to blame ourselves, right? So there's no learning or growth, right? And, there's so low self-worth, and when we criticize ourselves, we actually become really sensitive to criticism from others. It's not very easy to take feedback, okay? Now, what is self-guidance? Self-guidance means that if I've done something wrong, I actually face up. I have the appropriate guilt or remorse. Guilt or remorse is not self-criticism, right? It is actually, again, it's an emotion that guides us to do the right thing. When we have healthy guilt or healthy remorse, we should. If we've done something wrong, our inner voice, our inner guidance system should tell us, you know what, this is not legit. You did not live up to your values in that instance. When we are able to do that with self-compassion, then we can be focused on what I can do differently, where I can make amends. Do I need to apologize to someone? What do I need to clean up, right? It's positive and it's solution and it's future focused, okay? Self-criticism, on the other hand, when, so say I did the same thing, it exaggerates the faults, the guilt, the remorse, and there's good guilt and then there's shame, right? Guilt means that, yes, I did something wrong, I need to make amends. Shame is not that I did something wrong, but I am wrong, I am bad. And when I am bad, what can I do? Even if I make amends in this situation, I'll always be bad, right? It focuses on where you messed up rather than how you can improve. And it is negative and problem focused and past focused, okay? So the idea again is that why we deserve self-compassion is because, we should offer compassion towards the person that we have the most power over, which is our future self. What we do today is going to determine where we end up, right? And again, to remind ourselves that it's really good for other people in my life if I am compassionate towards myself. If I'm kind towards myself, I can be kind to others. If I'm not kind to myself, I cannot give to others what I don't have for myself. I cannot pour water from an empty jug. Okay. So now practicing self-compassion, but this is a lot of talk. So I'm going to take a pause here, a breath here, and I hope there are some questions or comments. Again, I'm, staring into a blank computer screen. So it's kind of hard. If some people could at least put on their videos, that would be amazing.
Okay, so we have one question. Which is complimenting yourself a form of self-compassion?
Can she say more?
So Insia, do you have anything to add to this question? Could you clarify? So while she's asking that, if anyone else has any other questions, you can either raise your hand on Zoom, or you can unmute yourself, share your video with us, and let us know what your question is. Anyone? So we have a question here. Mm-hmm. So this is a question. It may seem like a silly question. No questions are silly. But if success is not based on your achievements, then what is success in life based on?
Okay, lovely. Love that question. Thank you.
Existential.
Well, I'm going to answer it not from an existential perspective. Okay, I'm going to answer it from a very mundane and practical perspective, right? So actually, let me. Can you see me?
Yeah, we can see you.
Okay. So I'm not sure where the screen comes in. Anyway, so there's two things, right? And this is a key distinction in life, actually. And if we get that, it's so important for many different things. So we have control over our own actions, right? And that is what I call process. So we have control over the process. That is, say, for example, if I'm in university, right? What do I have control over? I have control over how much I study. I have control over where I study. I have control over, what kind of books I buy. I have control over all of these things, right? What do I not have control over? I actually do not have control over my grades. People think they do, but actually they don't. Because the grades actually depend on many, many different factors, a lot of which are outside my control, right? So it could be the curve, it could be how well other people did, it could be the kind of mood the professor was in, like it could be many different things. So I actually do not have control over the outcome, right? I only have control over the process, right? So can you see the difference, right? One is the process, which is my actions, and the outcome, which is the final result, which is outside my actions. Now, obviously, generally, if I do the right things, when I say right, I'm not talking in a moralistic sense, I'm just talking about, what I need to get done in order to achieve a goal. So for example, if I study hard, if I put in the time, if I get help, if I do all of these things, the likelihood is that I will do well. That's the likelihood, right? So the way, one way to envision quote unquote success, and this is a huge topic, right? But one way to envision success is, did I do what I could do, right? Did I put in my best? Did I do whatever I could if I did that, and by the way, this is how Allah judges us, right? Then that's success, whether or not I actually achieved the final goal or not, right? Now, again, I was going to say something else, but it's gone completely out of my mind. So, this is how it's a more hopeful way of defining success. And by the way, even if you look at the Quran, if you look at how, spirituality, think of all the prophets, all of them, right? All of them who came down, what were they accountable to Allah for? Would we consider them a success? If you look at just the numbers that they converted, if you look at, how many people believed, you could argue that they were not quote unquote successful, right? Look at Nabi Nuh alayhi salam, right? Preached for 950 years, had a handful of followers, right? But Allah only requires them, like he keeps telling the prophet, you, like, not in these words, right? These are my words, but you do your job, and your job is not to convince them, right? Your job is to pass the message. Your job is to live by example. Your job is to be a good leader. Whether or not they obey you, whether or not they follow you, really that's not what you're held accountable for, right? By the way, as parents, if we could really get this in our heads, our children's lives would be so much easier. Our own lives would be easier, right? Because we are so focused on the outcome, but outcome is never up to us. So many things can go wrong. So many things can, we think, go wrong, but be a blessing in disguise. It could be anything, right? But if we follow the principle of just focus on the process, what can you do? What can you do? Then if somebody is living their best self by doing that process, to me, that would be success. And I would love to hear everyone's views on this.
Yeah, if anyone would like to add to that, this is, we can make this a discussion. It'll be very fruitful. So you're more than welcome to add your comments. Also, Sister Merzia, there are some of us who have our video on. So you might be on speaker view. There's a button there with like a bunch of squares on it, like a grid. If you click that, you'll be able to see us and yourself, as well as the PowerPoint, like on the side. Yeah, we're here. So is there, Sister Alina or anyone, would you like to comment on that? Anyone else would like to add anything on that? We have one more question here. It's an anonymous question. So how do you balance self-compassion or self-recognition without feeding your ego?
Okay, that's a really good question. And I would say hang on to that, because when we talk about, what is self-compassion, like what are the components of self-compassion, that will become clear. And I think it will also become clear, going back to the previous question about, is what was it? Self-praise?
Self-compassion and feeding your ego.
No, what was the previous question about? Something about praising, looking at yourself in the mirror and praising yourself or something?
Oh no, so is complimenting yourself a form of self-compassion? So she said just generally like complimenting yourself, is that a form of self-compassion?
Oh, it's actually not. Self-compassion, like think of self-compassion as having goodwill towards yourself. Right? So complimenting yourself, and like affirmations and things like that, if it's working for you, right, within, if you don't overdo it, I think it may have a place. The problem with affirmations and with looking at yourself and telling yourself how beautiful you are, a lot of that is actually trying to get away from feelings of worthlessness, right? And what I'm saying is that self-compassion works better. The practice of self-compassion works better than the other practices to make yourself, quote unquote, feel better. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So say, for example, if I'm feeling ugly, okay, for whatever, okay, so I'm not feeling like, you know, I'm as nice looking as my friends or my siblings or whatever. And if I look in the mirror every day and I say, good morning, gorgeous, like you're beautiful. And, you know, that's what pop psychology tells you to do, right? Look at the mirror, say how you're gorgeous. And the thing is that if it's working for you, if it's making you feel good, if it's making you feel, you know, whatever, go for it, right? Generally though, it doesn't. And, you know, affirmations are a huge subject, which I have a lot of opinions on. But what I'm saying is that it's not the same thing. So self-compassion and praising yourself is not the same thing.
Okay. We have, I think, it seems like it's a bit of a follow-up to that. Can you please give some more succinct examples of what self-compassion actually is?
Okay. If we go on, I think the next slide hopefully will make it.
Sounds good.
Clear. Okay.
We have a comment. We do have one comment to what we were discussing previously, and it's put very well, that most of the learning and growth happens during the process and not at the end result. So, you know, more about it's definitely a lot about the journey than the final success points in life. So thank you for that.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay. So there are three components to self-compassion. Okay. So the first is an attitude. So the attitude is one of kindness rather than judgment. So say again, for example, I overslept, you know, 1 week in a row and I messed up and I got fired. Okay. Self-judgment would make it mean I'm useless, I'm no good, I'll never get this right, why can't I do this, you know, why can everyone else do it, and why can't I, okay? Self-kindness would simply mean that I acknowledge, ouch, that hurts. Being fired is like pretty sucky, okay? So I'm turning towards my pain, towards my upset with a feeling of kindness rather than judgment. Okay, that's the first part. The second part is common humanity versus isolation. What does that mean? You know, when we are struggling in life, no matter in what way, say I get fired, okay, from my job. When that happens, usually we get very into isolation. I think, you know, why is this happening to me? I'm the only one going through this. So pain and suffering can be very isolating from other human beings, right? Common humanity, on the other hand, means that I actually connect my pain to other people's pain. So common humanity would mean, you know what, a lot of people get fired. And it may not be, it could be something that I could have done better. And at the same time, there are many reasons why people get fired. You know, it could be that the company was downsizing, it could be a recession, it could be lockdown, it could be anything, right? And there are many people who get fired and many people who, you know, who struggle economically or whatever, right? Mindfulness means versus over-identification. Over-identification means that when something happens to me, I cannot look left or right. That consumes my whole being, okay? So if, for example, I break my leg, if I was over-identified, I could think of nothing else but my leg. You know, woe is me, I've broken my leg, I can't, you know, my career is ruined, I can't be on the sports team anymore, all of that, right? So I literally am consumed by the problem. Mindfulness means, on the other hand, that I can actually step back, I can take a step back and I can be a little bit more objective about the situation. That yes, it really hurts, you know, yes, it's a pain, yes, it's like really sucks, right? The fact that you are that I can't play anymore. But many people have gone through this. Many other people who are in this situation also feel, sad, disappointed, angry, upset, right? So that's the mindfulness component. And so again, let's talk a little bit more about this. So self-kindness versus self-judgment means treating yourself with care and understanding rather than harsh judgment. And you have a desire to alleviate your own suffering, and you actively soothe and comfort yourself. So, one of the things that we tell people all the time is, imagine that a friend came to you. Imagine your little sister you love a lot. She came to you and said, you know what, I lost my job because I couldn't wake up and I overslept for a week, and they gave me a warning and then they fired me. Okay. Now, if you were being your best self, not your big bully, critical big sister self, right? How would you treat your little sister or a friend? With kindness, right? You would say, you know what, it happens. Like, it's normal, it's human beings. You hadn't slept. You were really concerned about your friend's mother who was in hospital, and you were there for her. And, these things happen. So again, the idea is the desire to alleviate your own suffering, right? Then common humanity means that we see our own experience as part of a larger human experience, right? And recognizing that life is imperfect, and so are we. Asking ourselves, how am I the same as others, rather than how am I better than others, right? And being human by definition makes us imperfect, along with our imperfect life. Difficulty and failure are shared human experiences. This does not mean that we don't try to make it better. You see what I'm saying, right? It doesn't mean that, oh yeah, just human, I'm just imperfect. No, you do your best, and you recognize that perfectionism is not an achievable target. It's just not, right? And then mindfulness means you avoiding extremes of suppressing or running away with painful feelings. So allowing the painful feelings to be there. So rather than say, if I'm having a really bad day, okay, which many of us are these days. So if I was over-identified, I would just be under the covers and I would think, life is over, what's the point? It's, why would I do anything, right? Mindfulness means I recognize, I'm really having a hard time coping today. I'm not doing well. I'm feeling very anxious and sad and upset. And at the same time, I can see, these are feelings. Tomorrow will be a better day. You see what I'm saying? So it's not like you're so identified that you have a thought or a feeling and you can't look beyond. Even as you are having those feelings, you can see a better tomorrow. Okay. So again, the idea, the first, obviously, we need to be aware that our feelings are, that we're hurt, that we're upset, that we're going through distress. Part of mindfulness is recognizing, like checking in with ourselves and noticing how we are feeling. Many of us, we've never taken the time to do this. We've never been taught how to do it, right? And when we get into the habit of acknowledging, yeah, ouch, that really hurts. That is upsetting. I'm feeling sad. It doesn't mean that you're wallowing. It simply means that you are acknowledging, and you're not going to, it actually does the opposite. It means that you don't allow yourself to run away with your feelings, that you're not unleashing your feelings on other people, right? And having compassion rather than shoulding ourselves. What does that mean? Very often and these days, life is ripe for shoulding, right? So for example, if you're having a really hard day and you're having trouble, coping, what do we tell each other and what do we tell ourselves? Oh, I should be grateful. I should feel happy. I should, right? If it's working for you, go for it. That's what I say, right? Generally, though, it's not. What we're doing is we're actually denying how we are feeling. Now, self-compassion would mean that it's not like we're not grateful. It's not like we don't understand, that yes, we have it better than, 99.98% of human beings, right? And you know what? we don't need to ration our compassion. You can have compassion for others and you can have compassion for yourself. Like, the healthcare workers who are struggling are not going to be better off or worse off because I'm strict or compassionate towards myself. Does that make sense? So it's not like, I'm going to no, I can't feel sad for myself. I should feel I should feel grateful. I should feel happy. And all my compassion should only go to people who really deserve it, right? Unfortunately, it doesn't work like that, okay? So I'm going to stop here for another second and see if there are any other questions. These are all really, they are big concepts in the sense that, some of us, this might be the first time we've heard of something like this and we may be thinking she's crazy. So I'm just going to stop and see what's in the room.
Yeah, so we'll wait for a few questions, but I do agree. I do think sometimes we tend to rush, or we have a habit of rushing through our negative emotions, or we are taught that it's better to rush through our negative emotions, and we get very uncomfortable just sitting with negativity, or just sitting with, not negativity, but sitting with anxiety or sitting with sadness and just letting it be around. So do you have any practical tips on how we can kind of either learn to get comfortable with sitting with negative emotions for a little longer and not rush through them?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And in the meantime, anyone else can ask questions in the chat box. Yeah. Sorry.
So, exactly what you said, right? It is sitting with. So again, it's a practice. Practice means that while I am doing it, it will happen. And when I'm not doing it, it's not happening. You know what I mean? So I always think, okay, salah is a practice, right? Paying attention in salah is a practice. What do I mean by that? So for years, I would make myself wrong that why can't I focus in namaz? Why do all the thoughts come in while I'm trying to pray, right? And while I'm praying, a thought would come and then I would fight with myself because I got that thought, and then go on and on about, why can't I do this? Now what's happening, right? The one thought has become 20 thoughts, right? So instead of being, say, if this was attention focus in salah, instead of being 1 degree removed, now I'm 50 degree removed because I'm fighting with myself. So what am I not doing when I'm fighting with myself? I'm not focusing, right? So one of the most profound statements that I came across was this: if your attention wanders 100 times, simply bring it back 100 times. That's it. It sounds so simple, but it's actually revolutionary. What does that mean? So, okay, I notice my attention wanders, I simply bring it back rather than engaging in all the self-criticism, self-judgment, because what that does is gets me further away from my attention, right? So similarly with negative feelings, the quickest way through feelings is through them. Because if you just let feelings be, and you notice them, acknowledge them, and practice, again, it's a practice, distress tolerance, right? Distress tolerance means that I just check in with myself. I'm feeling kind of anxious. Okay, where am I feeling anxious? How do I know I'm feeling anxious? I have knots in my back, my neck feels tight, my shoulders are all hunched up, all of this is happening, right? If I just tune in and let that be, as I'm paying attention to it and having an attitude of kindness towards myself, I will notice the feelings begin to change. Because the thing with emotions is that they move. That's the definition of emotions, right? Something that moves. So they will come and they will go, right? However, if I start shoulding on my feelings, right, and have feelings about my feelings, so say if I'm feeling sad or upset, then I'm making myself feel bad about the fact that I'm feeling sad or upset, then what am I doing? I'm actually feeding the feeding the stress, I'm feeding the anxiety, I'm keeping it going rather than letting it take its due course. Does that make sense? So the idea is that we just literally be with it, we notice it, we label it. Labeling is a very, very powerful technique. So you simply, like, you tune in. Tune in means, okay, you close your eyes, you just notice what's going on. And how do I know that it's a feeling and not a thought? Because very often say, you know, I feel this, I feel that, but we're actually talking about thoughts. I know it's a feeling because I can actually feel it in my body, right? It's neck down. If it's neck up, it's a thought, okay? So I feel like that person is an idiot is not a feeling, it's a thought, okay? So feeling is, okay, I'm feeling anxious, I'm feeling sad, I'm feeling, you know, 1 million different emotions, okay? I just label them. So, you know, I guess that seems like anxiety, or maybe it's just, you know, a little bit of anxiousness. Okay. And as I begin to notice, I turn with kindness to it. I just pause. I notice it changing. Okay. And it may take a while or whatever, but the thing is, if it happens 100 times a day, you simply practice it 100 times a day, right? It only takes a few seconds. So, you know, that's how we practice being with painful emotions, rather than distracting ourselves, rather than turning away, rather than going for that piece of chocolate. You actually just focus on, you know, being with the emotion.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. We have one question, which is actually a very good question. So somebody's saying that this is definitely a new concept for me, practicing self-compassion. Question, what if I've come to terms with needing to be compassionate with myself, but my family hasn't got the memo? Yeah. How do you practice self-compassion on a day-to-day basis when you are needed by so many people or have so many responsibilities? It's a question from a mother with small kids, or I mean, I guess it would apply to anyone.
Okay, excellent. Yes, very good question. And the idea is that self-compassion does not require time. Okay, so that's the good news. It doesn't require time, and it doesn't require anyone else to, it's not about anyone else. You know, people can have their own judgments, they can have their own needs, they can have whatever. And the way I deal, it's literally my relationship with myself. So that's regardless of what else is happening around me. What makes self-compassion harder is not children, it's not being busy, it's not, you know, that's probably self-care, more like, you know, the time for self-care. And again, that's a whole different, you know, subject. But self-compassion is literally my relationship with myself. So I can be really busy and still be kind towards myself. How would I do that? So, like, for example, I don't know about you guys, but what I've been noticing these days is, because of everything that's going around and going on, I am really finding a challenge to stay focused. Okay, so I'm doing, like the other day, I did a really silly thing. I, you know, trying to save time, I said, okay, let me just put the egg shells that I was breaking directly into the compost rather than putting them in a bowl, which I normally do. So I go to the compost, I break the eggs, and I break the eggs right into the compost bowl, okay, rather than throwing the shells. Now, you know, happens, right? Now, for a while, I was really hard on myself, right? I was like, I can't believe I did that, and what a word. And then I remembered, practice self-compassion, right? These things happen when people are stressed, when we are, you know, thinking about all of these things, you know, going through whatever. It's normal. One of the side effects is that you lose your focus, you do silly things. So it's quite common. And, you know, as soon as I started doing that, the whole, the self-judgment, like, I can't do anything, right? Those eggs are gone, like they're done. So now what can I do is I can either make myself feel bad about it. How is that going to help? It's going to drain my energy from doing other things. Or I can simply, you know, practice kindness towards myself and says, you know what, it happens. It's very embarrassing, but it happens, okay? So again, when you're a parent, parenting, especially in our communities, is so fraught with this idea of perfectionism. We have this idea that we should be perfect parents and we should be a perfect mother, and it doesn't serve our children well at all, right? What does serve our children well is if I practice kindness to myself. I already recognize, what, I'm going to do my best and it's not going to be perfect, right? That's the attitude of self-compassion. If I'm happy, if I'm at peace with myself, that's actually the best thing I can do for my kids. The best thing. Because if I'm happy, my one mantra, which everyone's heard, is when mama's not happy, nobody's happy, right? One of the best ways to be there for my kids is to put on my own oxygen mask, be kind to myself, then I can be kind to them, right?
Makes sense. We have a comment from somebody regarding the past questions that we're discussing, that number one, this takes practice, definitely. It takes practice to kind of sit comfortably with our emotions, or rein ourselves in that 100 times. It definitely takes time and practice. And number two, she says, on another note, we're still far from allowing our boys to go through this process, in the sense that allowing boys and encouraging them to go through self-compassion is as important as we ask girls to, and it's crucial to the betterment of the society, as we often expect them to avoid emotions. So that's definitely a very true point. If anyone has questions, you can either ask by unmuting yourself, or write it in the chat box. One more question that, if I may add, what do you think is the role of trauma in the lack of self-compassion? And, how can someone kind of recognize that it might be stemming from trauma? And what are some of the signs that, hey, it's time to get professional help? I might not be able to do this on my own. Perhaps I don't have the right friends or family around me to understand or to support me in this journey of self-compassion, if that's an answer.
Okay, those are a lot of questions, and actually, each of them we could talk for hours on. So
okay.
I'm going to take just the last bit, that how do I know I can't do this on my own, and how do I know I need help, right? I don't think there's any magic, sign that you need help. The thing with speaking to a professional or seeking guidance, consultation from someone, is that it can benefit anyone. Like, you don't need to be traumatized, quote unquote. You don't need to be mentally struggling, In fact, it's people who are really on the top of their game. Like, everyone gets, people who are the top CEOs, the top business people, the top sports figures, they all have coaches, right? They all have coaches. Why? Because they recognize that someone else can drive them forward, right? So it doesn't have to be an admission of not being able to do it yourself, right? That's a really important distinction to make, that seeking help doesn't mean, oh, I just can't do this on my own, right? You can. A lot of people can help themselves, and you can go so much further if you get consultation from someone else, right? Trauma is like a huge thing. It means different things. And where does trauma and self-compassion come in? Again, self-compassion can be a very important addition to trauma healing. It probably would not be the only thing you would do, right? If you really have a background of abuse or trauma, like a big T trauma, we call little t trauma and big T trauma, right? So big T trauma means that something major has happened in your life. You have PTSD, or you have a background in assault, abuse, whatever, okay? Or just a really struggle childhood. And it doesn't have to be that negative, but you could just be a sensitive soul who took it on, okay? so self-compassion can, whatever you're doing, right? Like, for example, now the way I work with my clients is like, it's self-compassion is just part of the deal. Why? Because it makes everything go so much easier when you're not fighting with yourself, right? Then you can focus on other things. So what I'm saying is that self-compassion is the beginning, but it's not the end. You still need other coping strategies, right? It's a very valuable coping strategy, but it's not the only thing. Like, you still need other pieces of the puzzle. I hope that helps. And by the way, just I'm not sure where to put this in, but just for people to know that there are many, many resources available out there for many things. So just like on my own website, I write a daily blog, like a daily wisdom email that goes out. So you can sign up on my website, and every day it's just a short blurb. So lots of things that we've talked about, like we're up to 730 posts now. So there's a lot of stuff there. And on the Facebook page, there are long videos on, especially for parents, actually a lot of things for parents. There's one on self-care for busy parents. That's what it's called. I think that's also in the podcast, but I'm not sure, but it's definitely up as a video. And all of these things. So, reading stuff, listening to stuff, watching stuff, all of these can help you in your journey, right? And the way I look at it, we don't get, life is challenging, and we get no bonus points for making it harder than it has to be. So whatever we can do to make our lives easier, we really should, because life will throw us challenges in any case, right? So before we end, actually, I really do want to do a practice, like actual meditation, a practice, so that people know what I mean by when we say practice self-compassion. So with this, if there are no other questions, then we can perhaps go there.
Sure. Yeah, if nobody has any last minute questions, if you do, it would be easier if you could unmute yourself and ask. And I will reiterate what Sister Marzieh said, that, it's always good to get help. You don't have to have gone through, the big capital T trauma to realize that you might just need an extra helping hand. And what we will do is in the group that we have, the International Students Group, as well as in the chat, if Sister Marzieh, you can put in your website so we can access these videos and podcasts that you're talking about.
Sure, and
so
also
that would be a great resource for mothers.
Also, for our community, like, I'm not sure where people are watching from, but for the ISIJ community, we also have a service which is sponsored by the community. It's called Jaffrey Support Services, and we actually have 2 counselors on staff, and it's a free service for the community. So please use it. It's, they, between the 2 of them, they are there most days, and now obviously everything is online as well. So we can also put that. If actually you could look up the,
sure. I have that information. Yeah, I'll put that in as well. Okay. So I don't think we have any questions. I think we can start the practice.
Okay. So just go ahead, and if people can just find a comfortable spot and just close your eyes for a minute. And just develop a habit of noticing what happens when you feel hurt or worried, upset, irritated. What if we get in the habit of starting with a few seconds of self-compassion as soon as we feel bothered by something? So just reminding ourselves that self-compassion is where we start, not where we stop. Once we practice self-compassion rather than self-judgment or criticism, we can free up a lot of energy that would otherwise go into being at war with ourselves. So this is an exercise called self-compassion break. Let's think of a situation in our lives that is difficult or painful or stressful. Just bring the situation to your mind And see if you can actually feel the stress in your body, the emotional discomfort. And as you start feeling the discomfort or the stress or the upset, it could be resentment at somebody else, or it could be upset at what's happening in the world. Just say to yourself, this is a moment of suffering. You could say things that make more sense to you, like this hurts. Ouch. I'm feeling really sad or upset or anxious right now. So basically, we just begin by acknowledging what's happening. We begin by acknowledging what's already here. And then secondly, we remind ourselves that our suffering is because we're human. That pain and suffering is a part of life. That I'm not alone in this. Other people feel this way, have felt this way, are going through this or similar things right now and at all times. That as human beings, we all struggle in our lives. That pain and suffering is a natural part of life. That it's normal to feel this way when things are challenging. That we're all going through challenging times right now. As you're saying these things to yourself, gently place your hand over your heart. And as you breathe, just feel the warmth of your hands and the gentle touch of your hands on your chest. Just spend a moment just feeling what that feels like. The warm and soothing touch of your own hand over your heart. And now say to yourself, may I be kind to myself. You can also ask yourself, what do I need to hear right now to express kindness to myself? And say whatever you need to hear. You can also say this part like a prayer or a dua, turning to God and invoking His compassion towards yourself. Reminding yourself that He is the all-merciful, and being part of His creation, you are also a part of His all-encompassing mercy. That you're part of the mercy that He has created. You can say things like, may I give myself the compassion that I need. May I accept the way that I'm handling this situation. May I cope with kindness and compassion towards myself. May I learn to accept myself as I am. May I forgive myself. May I be strong. And may I be patient with myself. Just reminding ourselves that we can say any of these things in our own words. Whatever will help remind us to turn with kindness towards ourselves. Just staying with this practice for a few moments more. Just feeling the warmth of our hearts on our hands on our hearts. Allowing the kindness and the compassion to well up and surround ourselves. let's just end with a prayer that maybe be kind to ourselves and find it easier to be kind to others as well. When you're ready, you can open your eyes. Questions, comments? How did that go?
Thank you. That was actually very helpful and very calming and much needed, I think, for many of us. I've added Sister Marzia's website in the chat box, as well as the link to the Daily Wisdom. There's also the link to ISIJ's JSS, Jaffery Support Services website, and the contact details of the counselors. And there's also a link to her book, Parenting in the Digital World. So that's all on the chat box. If you want access to it, you can just copy and paste it somewhere where you can kind of come back to it. Does anyone have any final questions or comments? So we have a comment that thank you very much for this amazing exercise. May Allah bless you, inshallah. Ameen.
Thank you.
Anyone else with any questions? There was a question about earlier about the PowerPoint, if they can have access to it or where they can have access to it.
Sure, I will put it on my website. And so it will be basically marziahassan.org/workshops.
Okay, perfect. So you guys can access it there. Okay, so I think we'll end here if nobody has any questions. There's a lot of thank yous that I'm getting privately as well. Thank you so much.
And
so we'll end with a short
session next week. And if people have ideas on what we want to talk about, that would actually be quite helpful.
Yeah, so if you guys have any questions or anything that you'd like to discuss, you can even message me or the Dua Nudba admin and just let us know what you'd like to talk about. So we'll end here with a short dua. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ اللَّهُ الصَّمَدُ لَمْ يَلِدْ وَلَمْ يُولَدْ وَلَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ كُفُوًا أَحَدٌ صَدَقَ اللَّهُ الْعَلِيُّ الْعَظِيمُ. Thank you, everyone. Inshallah, have a good night. Take care. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Take care.
Khabafis. You too.